Shall I talk now, Rath?
Yes, please, Rowan.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so I just wanted to introduce the theme, really. We're very much trying to explore attention. We like to do that in embedding nonviolence when tensions emerge. And the one that's current for us at the moment is that many people feel rage about police violence towards them or others, and that some people want to be able to vent this and to shout about it. So we've got that on the one hand. And on the other hand, we've got the fact that de-escalators need to maintain what we call the non-violent container, which is recognizable, discernible. It's got no clear boundaries, but it's discernible by bringing an atmosphere of calm, of color and music, beauty, drama, smiles, people gathering together and dancing, maybe. And that's a container that supports non-violent confrontation to take place in a way that's going to create change. So when people shout and vent rage, it really shakes up that non-violent container, and it makes the task of de-escalators on the street much more difficult. So, there's the tension. As time's been going on, we've realized that this rage at injustice is something that needs to be seen, it needs to be heard, and it needs to be honored. So this is another way in which the Overton window on non-violence is quite rightly being stretched. And it is a stretch for some, including some in our own circle. So thinking about this, a source of inspiration for me in the honouring of rage is the work of Joanna Macy. And she has an exercise called the Truth Mandala. If you're familiar with that work, it's a participatory exercise which invites and holds the expression of strong emotion like fear and grief, and it also includes rage. And she also creates a container, a bit like the non-violent container, that enables these strong emotions to be expressed in ways that feel safe. So obviously this is a form that's intended for a safe space and not part of a civil disobedience. But nevertheless, it inspired me to think about how we might find a way with this that invites and holds and honours the truth of rage. It is a form of truth. So in a non-violent civil disobedience context, I think this can be eased with skillful framing. So often helps non-violence to be seen and understood, and also platforming of this particular manifestation of truth that will enable the rage to be hopefully truly and deeply heard by all, not to be expressed to one particular person, but to be expressed where the power lies, at the oppressive institution. And this kind of framing, this kind of skillful framing and platforming is hopefully going to support de-escalators who are leaning into this new learning for embedding nonviolence to do their job well, and also to give confidence to those who are still feeling their way into that stretch. One thing about it is that if that platforming and framing isn't present, what it leaves us with is having to track people who are just, apparently randomly shouting. And from our point of view, we don't know what they might do next. And shouting is often an indication of violence coming down the road. So here's the tension that I hope we're going to explore this evening. And also, I want to say my comment about, is non-violence possible? And I say, no, it's not. Non-violence is impossible, because it's all in the reaching. It's in the reaching for non-violence that's where the power is. The fact that it's impossible doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep reaching for it. And I think that that's what non-violence is all about. And I feel, particularly feel that in the UK, XR in the UK, we have a duty to uphold non-violence in relation to the police, because we're possibly the best placed in the world to do this. White folks at least can afford to do this, and we can put our privilege to good use. So I think we need to keep reaching for non-violence, however impossible it might seem, and keep trying to make it as possible as we can. And one person who's very recently done this, someone who experienced police violence yesterday and sustained some injuries, is John Fuller. And he's making a formal complaint about it, and yet he says that he doesn't hate the police. So there you go. I'll leave you with sending your good wishes to John, and we'll move into the first of our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Rowan. Shall I go next?
Yes, so that's you, Shantigarbha, if you would take it away.
There's a clarifying question Nancy was trying to ask.
Rowan, could you clarify what you mean by platforming, and specifically when we're in an action, what do you mean by?
Well, I'm just wondering whether, in terms of the timing, it might be an idea to keep the questions till the end, because we're going to have a sharing circle at the very end of this. You know, I think that, you know, if you would save that, I think that's an important question, because if you don't understand it, probably lots of other people don't understand it either. So if you can hold on to your hat.
Yeah, please, if people have questions, if things come up for them and they hear a question, they have a question, please put it in the chat, and then we have a record to ask for later, so we can keep on to them so we don't lose them.
Right, great idea.
Okay, so just want to say thank you to Rowan. I really enjoy the discussions I've had with Rowan over the last few years about non-violence. In relation to non-violence, I found Rowan's ideas and approach very stimulating, and some of her ideas about non-violent disruption I've included in the book that I've just written. So thank you very much to Rowan for your stimulation in this area. So, topic of anger. I'd like to start with that, the topic of anger. I guess there are elements of our culture, particularly when we learn about non-violence or pacifism, there are elements of our culture that tend to demonize anger. So I would say, first of all, let's not demonize anger in the way that, as Rowan was saying. People will express themselves using whatever language they've got. And whatever concepts they've got. The question is, can we find the life in it? Can we find the kernel of truth, or the kind of the needs or the values behind that expression? Anger can have a protective function, as Rowan and Joanna Macy says. It can be about protecting freedom, it can be about protecting safety, it can be about protecting equity, particularly equity of people with different coloured skin in this case. So I'm curious and interested how we find the life in our anger and in other people's anger. And on the nonviolent communication workshops that I run, we explore this. We train ourselves to hear or to find the life in anger. So I'll come back to that in a moment. We need to distinguish from a Buddhist perspective. We could distinguish between anger and hatred. So anger could just be an explosive expression of frustration. Okay. Trying to get through to somebody, trying to express somebody, trying to express something, and not being confident or being extremely doubtful that you're going to get through. So basically, you just raise the volume and the intensity to try and get through to the other person. You know, so it could just be an expression of frustration. Whereas hatred is wishing harm to the other person. So from a Buddhist perspective, from a Dharmic perspective, that would be termed unskillful. I would describe that as unskillful in the sense that it leads to more suffering for yourself and for others. So I recommend that we distinguish between anger on the one hand, which can just be a sudden explosion of frustration, and hatred, wishing another person harm, which is going to lead to suffering for yourself and others in whatever time frame. So that helps me to stay with anger when I hear it. And we need to find a powerful way to express the core of our anger without suppressing it, without repressing it, and without denying it. So if we think that anger is wrong, then we're going to push it away, we're going to suppress it, or we're going to repress it or deny it, try and get rid of it in some way. So how do we find the life in our anger? Well, very briefly, by listening for our should thinking, our thinking about what should or shouldn't happen behind those, behind the anger. So thoughts about the police, or thoughts about fossil fuel extractors, or what have you, things that they should do or they shouldn't do. And then underneath that, connecting with the needs or the values that we're trying to protect or we're trying to uphold. So in particular, things like care for the earth, protection of current and future generations, protection for people and animals that don't have a voice. And so that brings up my protective instincts, my protective, my sense of wanting to protect. We have little signs saying conscientious protector. So I definitely see myself in that role as a conscientious protector of this and future generations. Yeah. So that's something about anger and something about finding life, the life in your anger. Now, obviously, there's a lot more to be said about that, but I just want to talk a bit more generally about non-violence in the Buddhist tradition, and then also Marshall Rosenberg, who I studied with for quite a number of years, learning non-violent communication. So in the Buddhist tradition, the principle of non-violence is ahimsa. You probably come across this, the word ahimsa. So non-violence means, or ahimsa means non-harm or non-harming. So at its extreme, it means not killing. Okay, so non-harm, not killing. However, there's also what you do. There's what you don't do, which is killing and harming. But what you do is love each other, or love for the earth, and love for each other. So there are two aspects to non-violence. There's what you're not, what you're refraining from, and then there's what you're doing, what you're cultivating, which is love for the earth and for each other. So the Buddha was involved in non-violent social change. You may not have come across this, but he, just one example that I'm fond of giving, he came across his relatives. So he came from two different tribes, or his family came from two different tribes. And he came back one day, came to visit them, and they were just about to go to war with each other, just about to go into battle. So he stood in between the battle lines. He put himself in between the battle lines, and he just asked, well, what happened? What happened? What's in modern phrase like, what's all this about? Nobody could answer. Nobody could answer him. Nobody could tell him what had happened. The kings and the warriors all going out to kill each other had no idea what it was all about. Anyway, eventually they went to talk to the laborers, the hired laborers. So this is ancient India, but it's very modern parallels. They went to talk to the hired laborers on both sides, and it turned out it was a dispute about water, about irrigation, about resources. So it happened even in ancient times. There wasn't enough water to irrigate the crops on both sides of the river. So it turned out to be a dispute, and it was going to be a war about resources. Now, the kind of modern parallels with like climate, the climate change are kind of horrific, but very revealing that this is what happened. So he put himself in the middle and he said, well, what happened? You know, what's this about? What's the dispute about? So that's one example. And through that kind of questioning and dialogue with both sides, eventually they just gave up and went home. They realized actually their lives were more precious than the water that they were fighting over in that instance. So they just turned around their chariots and went home. Second example of nonviolent social change is that the Buddha sanctioned his disciples to release animals from hunters' traps. So if one of his disciples, a monk or a nun, found an animal trapped in a hunter's trap, the Buddha said, if you release it out of compassion, that's fine. Yeah. So there's kind of an echo there of non-violent disruption there. That we're trying to release something that is trapped on compassionate grounds. So that's the Buddha disrupting business as usual. So I'd like to give those two examples. There are other examples to do with caste and ignoring the caste system that was there in India at that time, but I'll leave that there. Coming to Gandhi, be the change. And then Marshall Rosenberg, who was very much a student of Gandhi and Martin Luther King, and called his system, or called his what he developed, nonviolent communication, based on to echo or to hark back to Martin Luther King and Gandhi's programs of nonviolent social change. So Marshall talked about transforming the social structure within ourselves. So finding the spiritual basis of social change and transforming the social structure within ourselves on the basis that we could end up recreating the kind of structures we now have if we're just trying to tinker with the external structures, with the institutions. So we need to come from a deeply compassionate, deeply non-violent place in order to transform the structures around us in a non-violent way. So something there about means and ends. Yeah. So we could end up recreating inequity, prejudicial thinking, and so on, if we don't come from that place. Yeah. So how are we going to do that? Well, Marshall Rosenberg talked about showing another way of doing things which is less costly and more fun. So I really try to remember this when I'm engaged in social change, nonviolent social change, that we're trying to show a different way which is less costly all round and definitely more fun for everybody. More fun as in richer, more creative, more satisfying. Thank you. Yes, less costly and more fun. So now, of course, that's a lot more challenging than some other ways of trying to do social change, because it involves a great deal of creativity on our part, or on my part, to try and do that. Like, well, how do I show a different way from, the current use of fossil fuels in the world? That's pretty challenging. I find that really deeply challenging. When we're doing nonviolent social change and nonviolent disruption, one thing I love about Extinction Rebellion is the creativity that is put into that, the color and the sound, sometimes deafening sound, but certainly sound, and creativity that goes into it, and the different things that pass through, including meditating Buddhists and samba bands and clowns and cricket and citizens' assemblies and street theatre and blackbirds and red rebels and penguins. Yes, don't forget the penguins, and all sorts of other stuff. So I love that richness and creativity. So for me, that's ticking the box of more fun, that we're showing a different way that's more fun, that's richer and diverse and creative. Showing a different way that's less costly and more fun includes, I would suggest, empathizing with the needs that people are currently trying to meet in using fossil fuels, in doing the things that have led to this climate and ecological emergency. So empathizing with the fears and the needs of those people, because they're not going to shift their ground unless they have a sense that they're being understood in some kind of way. Now, I'm not suggesting that empathy is the be all and end all here, because in my book, in a non-violent social change context, empathy is about removing the blocks to action. Empathy is about removing the blocks to action. It's not an end in itself. It's about how do we remove the blocks to action for ourselves and for other people. So when I'm empathizing with people, when I'm acknowledging those fears, I'm doing it because I know that some space will open up, is likely to open up for something different to happen. And that's the value of empathy. So I think I'll pause there for a minute. Yeah, I'll pause there. So any questions or comments? I saw a few comments coming through on the chat. So any particular questions or just comments that I might respond to? So what's alive in you when you hear what I've said about finding the life in anger and non-violent social change, and yeah. Okay, so what have we got there? More about empathy and blocks to action. So, okay, well, here's a kind of relatively simple example. So, one of the things that I come across, as soon as you kind of scratch the surface when you're talking about non-violent, when you're talking about the climate and ecological emergency, people's defenses come up. Now, just in the last few days, we've been talking about it in the Exile Buddhist. People have been saying, well, their friends and their family know about this stuff, but they don't really want to look. Frankly, they don't want to look. They don't want to look any further or any deeper because they're afraid they're going to get overwhelmed. They're afraid they're going to get kind of, just swamped or kind of stop functioning. So there's a kind of protective thing going on there. We're trying to protect ourselves from how we might feel if we really took it on board, what's going on. Yeah. So I would just acknowledge that. I would just say, okay, so I can hear you just want to protect yourself from the awfulness of it or the kind of horror you might feel if you really let it in. So just even that moment of empathy, just acknowledging the fear, acknowledging the overwhelm and the wish to kind of protect yourself. And through that acknowledging, for a few seconds, then something else will happen. It's very likely to happen. And then they might let it in a little bit. Yeah. And it's the same with the fears that, that lead to people or the fears or the things they're trying to do with the fossil fuels. Well, they want a sense of choice. They want a sense of abundance and richness in their lives. We can acknowledge that and point out that there are different ways of experiencing choice and abundance and freedom and so on. Angela says, can you expand a bit on not treating empathy as an end in itself? So empathy is so great and so wonderful and magical that sometimes we kind of go off on a sort of empathy trip and believe that it's the answer to everything. However, empathy, we also need honest expression or even scary honesty sometimes, because this is also important in the dialogue. We can be prepared to empathize, but also sometimes scary honesty in the sense of saying the things that are scary to say, or it might be scary to say, or it might lead to a rupture of connection. I mean, there's an echo here, a parallel here in nonviolent disruption, that we're doing something which is kind of scary. Yeah, it's kind of scary. And at the same time, it's because we want to start a discussion. So can we empathize with what comes up for people? Yeah. Can we empathize with their irritation or anger, their desire to get on with their lives, or, to have freedom of the streets or whatever? Any other
Thank you.
questions? Or are we done?
Any other questions?
Or just reflections in a way? I'd like to hear.
I have some thoughts. I'm going to keep them to the end for the listening circle.
Okay. Hearing your thoughts.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Shantigarbha.
Thank you.
Appreciated. Yeah, if people have questions, remember to put them in the chat for us to discuss afterwards if anything comes up for you. That was brilliant. There's some things I learned there. Aidan is up next.
All right, I will jump in. I'm actually going to share some slides here. So there we go. And I'm going to start a little timer so that I try to stay on track. And also I'm going to try to have this chat up if I'm talking too fast, which I know is going to be a temptation for me because there's a lot that I want to sort of cover on this, what I think is a really rich topic. So if you ever need me to slow down the rate that I'm speaking, please say something in the chat. So yeah, I'll get into when Jen sort of was telling me about this and inviting me to give a comment, how I heard the question, or sort of reshaped the question or the tension that Rafs was naming earlier, or sorry, that Rowan was naming earlier. I heard it as like XR asking, one thing that's happening is that XR is asking, what are our boundaries around nonviolence? What does nonviolence mean to us? And both in the sense of, so we can say we're committed to nonviolence. Who defines what nonviolence is? Who defines the boundaries of it? And I think any group, any individual has to ask that question both, personally, myself, and in this case, as XR, as an organization, as a network, where are we setting those boundaries? And then there's another boundary maybe further out from that, which is, who are we willing to align with, or what are we willing to associate ourselves with? And where, maybe there's things that we wouldn't do, but we're okay with our allies. We're willing to ally with someone who considers that part of their idea of nonviolence, or isn't, does it, maybe they use the language of nonviolence or not. So that's kind of what was churning for me as I got into this. And I am just going to give a sort of little outline of 3 points that I want to hit on to explore that question. And I'm not really going to have a chance in 15 minutes to actually tackle that directly. So I'm hoping that this is sort of fodder for you all as you think about that. So one is that I'm going to sort of suggest or argue that, not arguing anything, but we're going to explore what is it like to try on that, like, of all the sort of values that are present in nonviolence, what if we think of humility as like the fundamental one, and what does that mean? So we'll talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about nonviolence as being kind of self-centered, meaning that it's about how we comport ourselves and not about going through the world demanding that other people live up to our standards of nonviolence. Obviously, that's an extension of humility. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how nonviolence transcends the sort of idea of ally and enemy. And usually we think about that, sorry, I have a helicopter flying overhead, you might be able to hear it. Usually we think about that in terms of, that we stop seeing people as enemies. But I'm actually going to see if we can extend that today. And what happens if we stop seeing people as allies too, in this kind of absolute sense. So we'll see if I can get through all that. And I'm going to really draw on a speech given late in Dr. King's life. So I should have said at the beginning, the perspective that I'm bringing to this is, I'm going to see if someone's asking me to slow down. Nope, great. The perspective that I'm bringing to this is from my position in the lineage called Kingian Nonviolence, which is basically a group of people who work to keep Dr. King's legacy alive by teaching a curriculum based on his work. So I'm going to draw heavily on a speech from late in Dr. King's life called The Crisis in America's Cities, which took place during 1967 when massive riots were breaking out in many cities in the United States. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second, that context. So starting with this first point, humility as the foundation of nonviolence. What do I mean by this? So, and actually, to talk about this one, we're going to go back a little bit to Gandhi. Gandhi often spoke about this. Thought that the fundamental thing, nonviolence is about love and truth. But for Gandhi, it was in some ways more about truth. It was the pursuit of truth, this constant questioning, and he was very adamant that satyagrahi, so meaning people, the soldiers in his movement, the nonviolent soldiers in his movement, be always, constantly asking, constantly open to the idea that all of their conclusions are wrong, everything they're working for is wrong, and they're actually the ones standing in the way of justice. And of course, we can't let that paralyze us. We have to act. We have to say, okay, my assessment of the situation is this, and I need to, that there's injustice happening, and I need to act to stop it. But what would it look like to act in a way that even if it turned out I was wrong, and actually my action was about to be, I was going to be the one standing in the way of justice, how could I conduct myself in a way that if that was true, I could still be proud of how I showed up, or I could still hold my head up and, say, yes, I was wrong. I can admit it later, and I haven't done anything irreversible. And, at the root, of course, violence is the most irreversible thing. Killing someone, if I kill someone and then it turns out I was wrong about, my political view or my assessment of the situation, I was missing some key information, I can't take that back. So that's one way to get to the kind of core commitment of nonviolence that we're not going to kill. But also, as we extend that, and nonviolence doesn't just mean not killing people, we can sort of explore the same principle. Like, I want to conduct myself in a way that never closes the door to reconciliation, always is willing to listen to another perspective, always has a level of doubt without that arresting me and freezing me up and making me unable to act. So hopefully it'll become clear why I wanted to bring that in, but I'm going to spend the bulk of the time on this second point, which is about nonviolence being kind of self-centered. I almost could have called it nonviolence is self-centered. That's what I wish I'd called this instead of this clunky sentence that I have here. So, meaning that it's a deep personal meditation, reflection on what am I going to commit to, and it's not about going around and saying, okay, everyone needs to act this way and demanding that other people act that way. And of course, that, like I said, there's a personal version of that, and there's a version of that says, and what organization am I going to be a part of? Or as an organization, we might, as a network, as a movement, we might make that same kind of decision. So to talk about this, we're going to look at this speech that Dr. King gave and want to just sort of position us of where this speech took place, because it feels important. So the civil rights movement in the United States, at the time it was called the Southern Freedom Movement. It originated in the US South, where segregation was very much out in the open, enshrined in law. This period you may have heard to refer to as Jim Crow. And the movement in the South, was vibrant through the 50s and 60s. In some ways, it climaxed in 1963 with a campaign in Birmingham, Alabama, the success of which led to the passage of two major pieces of civil rights legislation in 1964 and 1965. And in some ways, the stated goals of the Southern Freedom Movement were achieved. Segregation was abolished, voting rights were secured, at least for a time. And with these victories, the civil rights movement said, okay, in order to challenge the deeper, less kind of overt, but in many ways more pernicious forms of racism and segregation in American society, they realized they needed to move out of the South and into other parts of the country where racism was less, was more complicated. And so this was starting in 1965. Dr. King and other leaders shifted their attentions to the North, particularly with a focus on Chicago as the sort of jumping off point. And it was basically a huge failure. They attempted to use the same tactics that they'd used in the South, and they didn't work in the North because of, we'll get into why those dynamics were very different, or maybe we won't have time to get into it. And ultimately this led to an outburst of frustration in the Black community across the country in 1967, called the Long Hot Summer, where there were many race riots lasting days or weeks in many different US cities. you know, and in some ways these riots were tragic. They were very destructive to the communities that were already experiencing in so many ways they weren't constructive and deepened the suffering and the inequality within these cities. And in other ways, they were an important expression that highlighted the urgency of the situation. And this is what King was responding to, and he gave this not very well known, but very important. I think in my book, this might be certainly one of King's most important, one of the most important documents of King's life and philosophy is this speech he gave to let me see what I have. No. So he gave this to a gathering of civil rights leaders, essentially, the conference of his organization called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And I'm just going to go through some of the main points that he makes in this essay, and then we'll talk about how they're relevant to the situation that XR is in right now, which is a timeless situation, a timeless conundrum dilemma in social movements about the role of nonviolence and what it threads together and what it's capable of. So King starts the speech. So he's responding to these massive riots by Black communities, and people might assume that, as the sort of premier advocate of nonviolence at this time in the United States, King would condemn rioters and riots and condemn violence. And the truth is that King was very slow to condemn, throughout his life, very slow to condemn publicly or criticize publicly the actions of others in the movement. Instead, he would focus on the conditions that had led someone to riot. And so he opened the speech with this quote from Victor Hugo: "If the soul is left in darkness, sins will be committed. The guilty one is not he who commits the sins, but he who causes the darkness." So to start with, King shifts the attention or the focus from these, genuinely destructive, tragic outbursts of, expressions of rage and righteous indignation to justifying that underlying rage, just like Shantigarbha was talking about, sort of empathizing with and uplifting anger. So the white backlash, he's talking, what were the conditions that led to these riots? Well, the backlash by white people against the progress of the civil rights movement told the Black community that there were limits to their progress, that they must expect to remain permanently unequal and permanently poor, that true equality will be resisted to the death by the white community. And by death, he doesn't mean the death of white people, but the white community is willing to lynch and kill and do anything that they could to resist the march of equality and integration. And so King says the so-called riots in a distorted and hysterical form, and that's the strongest language that he'll ever use to condemn riots, and doing this in private with other civil rights leaders, in a distorted and hysterical form, were a Negro response that said inequality will now be resisted to the death. And we'll leave it there. So moving from, did I skip one? Yeah. So justifying righteous indignation, acknowledging not only that the emotion is real, but that the need for profound disruption that riots did accomplish, although not as productively as we might hope, as constructively as we might hope, acknowledging that need is real. So King said, there is probably no way, even eliminating violence, for the Black community to obtain their rights without upsetting the equanimity of white folks. All too many of them, meaning white folks, demand tranquility when they mean inequality. So, as we'll see in a moment, I'll go on. I'll stick to my slides, and then I won't get ahead of myself here. So, acknowledging the need for disruption, uplifting the agency of those people, so not condescending to them, resisting the temptation to condescend to the communities engaged in resistance in a way that he might not have agreed with or wanted to see. He said the riots are not simply a reign of terror or a splurge of crime. They are also a wildly emotional protest and a desperate attempt to display the utter desperation that has engulfed many Negroes. The vast majority who actively participated were remarkably discriminating in avoiding harms to persons, venting their anger by appropriating or destroying property. So they're saying, you know, despite the shocking, destructive nature of these, people were not, you know, attacking white people. The casualties of these riots were, the vast majority of them were Black folks killed by police. Instead, they were venting their anger on property. And King here making an early version of a point that's been made many times since, that of the ironic purpose to this choice, that in a society that cherishes property above people, you know, the only way we can get the attention of that society is to inflict destruction on property. So uplifting the agency, not, you know, acknowledging validating the feeling, the rage, validating the need for disruption, uplifting the agency of people who are making a certain choice, and then saying, taking responsibility as a leader of the movement and asking other leaders in the movement to take responsibility for why things look the way they look instead of the way they'd like them to look. So saying the time we have is shorter than many, the riots show that the time we have is shorter than many of us believed. Patience is running out. We have not devised tactics for reform in the North. We spent 10 years in the South using new tactics of nonviolence that were successful, but in northern cities, those tactics failed essentially. And King found that, you know, simply marching, tactics that were extremely disruptive in the American South, just Black people getting together and marching. In the North, that racism, segregation were different. They were more subtle. And so those tactics weren't disruptive. And he took it as basically a failure of the movement leadership to offer a sufficient alternative to channel the righteous indignation of the community into something constructive. And that in light of that failure, instead the community channeled it into something destructive. So he called for civil disobedience. And I'm sure that if he saw what XR was engaging in today, it would just be the exact kind of, you know, highly disruptive, constructive, nonviolent action to essentially, what he's essentially saying, I think, is that we have to, it's on us, if we want to see a nonviolent movement, it's on us to offer such a compelling strategy, you know, such a compelling, highly disruptive, yet highly nonviolent, compassionate approach that it wins over both sides of, you know, both those who would like to see a greater level of aggression and those who, you know, are turned off by disruptive movements because they don't want to, you know, they're put off by the anger or whatever. We want to bring both of those parties in with a nonviolent approach. And unfortunately, I'm running a little over time, so I might have to pause. Let me check. Yeah, check in with Jen here. Hey. Should I jump to questions now?
Keep going.
Keep going. Okay. All right. Well, the last section is just a little bit. So here we go. Third point here, and then we'll see if we can weave this all together. Transcending the idea of ally and enemy. So first, just continuing at this point I was just making at the end there, that nonviolence, King and others in the civil rights movement, even earlier, it's often been referred to as the third way. And there's a couple meanings of this. One is it's the third way between militarism and pacifism. So there's this age-old, and it sounds like, you know, I mean, in my time with XR, I spent a good chunk of time out in the UK with you all. Certainly XR was, you know, experiencing this. I've experienced this every movement space that I've been a part of. This tension between the sort of militaristic impulse and the pacifist impulse. And nonviolence is a synthesis of these two approaches. It takes the discipline and the determination and willingness to engage of militarism, and it blends it with the commitment to compassion and cherishing life of pacifism. And so it brings the best of both of these and offers an approach that we hope both parties can get behind. There's another sense in which nonviolence is the third way, which is this idea of multi-partiality. And I think this word has made it around in the XR community around internal conflict. So when we have a conflict within our community and we want to bring someone in to mediate that conflict, instead of saying that they're going to be impartial, we say we want them to be committed. Like we want them to be partial to every side. Like we want them to be deeply motivated to meet everyone's needs at the table. And we want to basically, in nonviolence, we want to apply the same concept to conflict at the social level. And this literally, you know, to King meant that he was just as committed to understanding the deep needs being expressed in racist views like those of the KKK and meeting those needs, not there's no, white supremacy isn't a need, domination over others isn't a need. It speaks to a deeper need, or that's not a need you wanted to meet, at least. And so we're asking the same thing. Like, as practitioners of nonviolence, as those committed to nonviolence, we're essentially coming into a space and we see there's a conflict here, and we want to understand all the parties in the conflict and understand what their needs are and try to devise a creative solution that meets all of those, meets the needs of everyone involved. We don't want to just switch it so that only, now the other side who's been historically oppressed, their needs are met, but now people who were historically in the oppressing role, now their needs aren't being met. That's not what we're here for. So that's where we get to sort of letting go of the idea of enemy. But something really, I think, magical happens when we let go of the sort of enemy-ally thinking. There's a kind of unexpected side effect of that, which is, and I think I don't really have any more slides, so I'm just going to stop sharing. This magical side effect of that is that when we're operating in that kind of enemy-ally mindset, and we orient the world into, okay, those people that's our opposition, and here's our allies. When then we find out, well, actually our allies, don't agree with us 100%, and no one ever agrees with anyone 100%, right? Suddenly it's a lot more painful, and in my experience, like, conflict inside of movements ends up taking up more energy than the movement is putting on, waging its battle. And this is because we can't tolerate even small differences in perspective and in, between ourselves and other, the people we are thinking of as allies. So it's letting go of this absolute notion of, okay, this person is my ally and this person is my enemy. We're moving to, okay, here's my goal. I have my creative solution in mind that's going to meet all the needs. And obviously some people are in a position where they're more likely to support moving towards that goal. So people in, countries that are about to go underwater because of rising sea levels, like, of course, in some ways, I'm not suggesting that we delude ourselves and don't realize that those people are more likely to cooperate with us than the CEOs of energy companies. But I am suggesting that we let go of this absolute notion of allies so that we can actually tolerate disagreement with those people and say this, and keep our attention on the goal, basically. So yeah, I could ramble more about that and say it another dozen different ways, but I'm gonna instead wrap up because I've already gone a few minutes over, and see if there's some questions.
Thank you very much. That was great. Maybe we could call a temperature check for a break, and then come back to questions, and people can kind of let what we've heard just settle and see if any thoughts arise up for them. And of course, we'll kind of address this between us and the listening circle. So Jen, can you see, I can see, do we have any, Rowan, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I'm just noticing that I've been sending messages to Skeena and we haven't heard back from her, and it's past 7:30. I suspect she's not going to be able to come, and I'm just wondering if we just take some of that time, because Aidan, maybe, I mean, I have the feeling that you didn't quite round up as you would have liked to, and it would be great to just hear a bit more from you if you would be up for doing that. But maybe we need to take a break first and then come back to you and check with you whether you want to continue. Maybe there's questions as well for Aidan and Shantigarbha. So
shall I ask the break like this? Does anyone object to us continuing on? So if someone needs a break, yeah, for concentration and comfort and ease, then if someone just says, yeah, they can message me or Jen. Otherwise, we'll continue. I know that Skeena's been very busy in the last few days and has been arrested and is juggling a lot of things on the ground as we speak. So that's probably why she hasn't been able to make it. But I'm not getting slight preference for 5-minute break and then continue. Yeah, 5-minute break. So I'm getting some requests for 5-minute breaks. So yeah, let's have a 5-minute break. So what time are we coming back, Jen? Sorry, I can't see a clock.
It'll be 43. So 43
past.
7:43. Yeah.
Okay. And as you're having a glass of water, let your thoughts bubble up. Okay, great. See you all back in 5 minutes. Jen, do you want to stop recording?
I've put a question in the chat for Aidan. I don't know if you've seen it. I was particularly interested in what you were saying towards the end of your talk about, this commitment and understanding of all needs, including our enemy, and also especially the difficulty in tolerating. I can't remember the word you used, but tolerating challenge, or the difficulty from our allies is something that I find really difficult. It's almost, it feels like betrayal or something like that, and that feels incredibly painful. And yet I feel that we have to take it, we have to take that on too. So I wondered if you've got any more to say about that.
Yeah. So I'm gonna try a framing of this that I haven't necessarily tried on before. So I'll apologize in advance if it goes horribly awry. But first I'll just name that one example that I've heard already mentioned today, and that Jen mentioned in advance, and which of course we have, this is a conversation I've heard many times in different movement spaces in the US, is about sort of how we engage with the police, and like whether we are trying to win them over with cupcakes, or whether we're shouting, cursing them out and things like that. And just how one thing is, how do I personally want to do that, and then another is like, okay, and how can I, what can I tolerate, what range of expression can I tolerate, and still put myself in a movement space. And so this framing that's almost coming to mind is like, so first of all, trying to get my thoughts organized here. So I'm sure we've all had the experience of, King has a quote on this, that lukewarm acceptance is more painful than outright rejection. And he was talking about, lukewarm acceptance by sort of white moderates in the civil rights movement, who said, yes, you're right, what you're saying should happen, but you need to slow down, you need to not be so disruptive and confrontational about it. And I think we've all had that experience too in our, in collaboration in movement spaces and XR, where we get more frustrated with someone who has a different idea about what the date of the next rebellion should be than with the CEOs of fossil fuel companies and banks. And of course that's because they're right in front of us, but there's a term in psychology for this called the narcissism of small differences, which is when we're very similar to someone, or when we feel very similar to someone, very small distinctions between us become blown out in our mind as huge, but they're just so much, we feel them as so much more painful. And the framing that came to mind as you were speaking, Rowan, is like a codependent relationship. Like it's losing the differentiation between ourselves and this other person, where we've collapsed ourselves into one entity, and we're like, when I stop this. I'm just exploring this idea that how profoundly unhealthy this is this kind of loss of self within a movement or an organization, where I can't anymore believe that I can have my own identity within this organization, and other people can have their own identities, and we can disagree about things and still hold together collaboratively because we are working toward the shared goal. And I'll give an example. So Raf's mentioned my own rooting in social movement work is in animal freedom. So I work on trying to abolish animal agriculture, essentially. And, you know, when I think about someone hunting animals, I feel very sad that happens, and my ideal world is one that doesn't happen in. But also there are many people who hunt animals who are, you know, who feel deeply connected to animals and to nature, and who find modern agriculture abhorrent. And even, you know, for some people can see that the idea of domestication of animals is abhorrent. Am I willing to, or can I find in myself the willingness to see that person as a collaborator, as an accomplice, and align with them and work with them towards a shared goal, even though we share this huge, really painful, you know, visceral disagreement in worldview, or difference in worldview. And for me, you know, I can easily say my goal is, yes, I want to be able to work with, you know, anyone who, if I can soberly say that, you know, I can, like, working with this person is going to bring us closer to a goal that we both share. You know, in reality, yeah, that's challenging. You know, so that goes back to what you were saying in the beginning. Nonviolence it's about reaching for that kind of ideal, and I'm not there yet either. I don't know if that answers that question at all, if that speaks to it at all.
Sorry, I just said, I think that's really great. And I love that expression of the narcissism of small differences. That's just beautiful. And I'm thinking, you know, as you're talking about the collapse into the loss of self, I'm thinking that Shantigarbha might also have something to say about that, especially from a Buddhist perspective, and confess that I'm a Buddhist myself. And yeah, loss of self is something that definitely interests me.
Well, yes, no, I was happy with that phrase about the narcissism of small differences, because I was just going to say the common sociological examples that I grew up with were, say, Catholics and Protestants. So from the outside, you know, Protestants and Catholics, they have quite similar kind of beliefs. You know, they're both Christians, or Sunnis and Sufi, you know, Sunnis and Shia. From the outside, they look like they're doing the same thing, but there's incredible tension and rivalry between them, because somebody who nearly believes what you believe is probably more threatening than somebody who doesn't believe what you believe at all. You know, from the perspective of group thinking or normative thinking in groups. You know, so there's this kind of tension between how do we emerge as individuals, at the same time acknowledging our kind of tribal affiliations, as it were, or our kind of group affiliations, and experiencing a strong sense of community as well. That's also one of the real richnesses of life, is that sense of community and belonging. So I think there's tension there between those two things, and challenging normative thinking, I suppose, of any kind, you know. And that goes for myself. It's like, you know, I have a kind of normative thinking about what's right and what's wrong in my head, you know, and I'm telling myself constantly about it, and I keep on trying to paint that onto the world as well. And so, you know, it's one of the reasons why I love what nonviolent communication expresses, which is it's about needs, it's about human welfare, and that thinking in terms of good and bad and right and wrong is a clumsy way of expressing that, and probably not very life-serving either. You know, it tends to lead to that kind of black and white thinking and punishment and reward and so forth. Yeah. So that was one thing I wanted to say. Yeah. There was something else that Aidan said that set me off, but I can't remember what it is now. So I'll pause. Yeah.
I'm seeing Viv's question.
Oh yes, yeah. Sorry. There was one more thing. Yeah. Just to kind of piggyback on what Aidan said. Yeah, the scientists are telling us we're in a climate and ecological emergency. So, what response does that call forth in us? who do we need to collaborate with in order to address it? You know, what kind of mass of people, what percentage of the population? I know there's, you know, there's Erica Chenoweth has done research on this, but it's like, well, there are going to be some differences in approach and ideas about how we go about doing that, you know, inevitably. And at the same time, we really do need to kind of a broad church. Not that I'm a Christian myself. We need a very broad church in order to address those issues. So, Aidan, would you like to respond to that?
Well, my gears are now going. Yeah, I'm just seeing.
Okay, you're somewhere else. It's okay.
No, it's okay. So Viv asked, having a sense of how to navigate, you know, this tension and tolerating these kind of differences as an individual. I'm wondering, or are you interested in exploring more the idea of a movement or an organization having to set its own boundaries around what itself does, and as well what, you know, what it's willing to ally with? Yeah, I think this is a really, you know, you're right. I totally said at the beginning that I was, you know, it's like, oh yeah, that's the thing. And then I didn't even want to it. And unfortunately that's because I don't, there's not a simple answer. I mean, it's tough because I think XR did, you know, from the outset, in some ways, it was almost as clear as you could be about how it wanted to relate to well, that's not necessarily true, but they tried to be, I think the early members of XR tried to be very clear about how they wanted to relate to nonviolence. And yet you are always going to find, you know, instances or examples that you couldn't predict, and you're always going to find people are drawn to it who, you know, don't align perfectly with that original vision, and so the vision is maybe evolving over time. You know, I think I'm thinking about an episode that I remember from 2019 when some people who were arrested and taken to a certain jail in London got out and then brought baked goods back and, you know, a thank you card for the police who arrested them. And then this got out on social media and they received a lot of criticism for, you know, it was mostly white arrestees, or maybe entirely white arrestees, and it was a police department in a neighborhood where there's been a few deaths of Black and brown folks at the hands of this very police precinct in the last few years, and that's very complicated. You know, there's not, I think, you know, one thing I'm wanting to say in response to that, and with this question, is like sticking to your nonviolent guns around, like, okay, knowing like this is why we're doing this and this is what we believe, and, you know, how can we say, like, yeah, we hear there's truth in this criticism, and, you know, we are connected to why we're approaching it this way. And I'm not necessarily saying, I mean, you know, I tend to lean towards that approach towards the police personally, and in movements that I would want to spend most of my time in, but it's a really difficult one.
Yeah, I just sharing your difficulty and not expecting an answer, and it just in me is this like tension, because I really liked what you said about remembering it's like my commitment to nonviolence, and it's not something I'm like demanding of anyone else, and like being a movement, then like, you know, that trying to do that at a movement level is like just, yeah, other than just really making a lot of mistakes and keeping having the conversation, or like, you know, finding that boundary and like, do we slightly go this way or this way, and just feels like it would need like quite a conversation that's like at the heart of the movement, if you know what I mean. It's like they're going to be an ongoing question, or is it always like an individual question, you know? So it's like that's what intrigues me from what you said. Yeah, I find it interesting.
This would be a good moment to introduce Viv. We requested that Viv help facilitate discussion at the end of this talk. So I mean, introduce Viv Slack now. I can offer to read some of the questions and comments briefly, to go through some of the feedback that we've been getting through the workshop. I don't know what you want to do, Viv, in terms of, I don't think we're in a big enough, we're in a small enough group to perhaps hold the whole conversation together as one. What do you think?
Sounds like it could be quite it could be quite a live thing rather than maybe reading. That was just my sense. I think it could work either way.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Jen.
Yeah, just wanted to give some space and opportunity for those who don't plan to stay for this last part of the evening. And before you go, though, we have to do some advertising. So I think, is there any time to do that? Is that a good time to do that now? Right. So advertising. So if you haven't been into a workshop for non-violence, we have one tomorrow. So Rath is actually running this tomorrow. It's more like tactical techniques and also some principles for crowds, non-violence. So there's a workshop tomorrow. So I popped that in the chat. And also
running it with Nancy.
Yes, great. Second thing, and is the escalator team. So rebellion is happening. If you are planning to be on the ground and you would be happy to join our team, please sign up to the rota and we'll buddy you up. And also, it's just a nice way to connect and support the movement and explore all these different nuances a bit further, through practice. And that's it for now, actually. And just also noticing Aidan's notes that, Aidan is gonna have to go. So big thank you. And there's so much I need to go back and look at the recording, basically.
Thank you, Aidan.
Yeah.
Thank you, Aidan. It was wonderful hearing you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We'll be with y'all.
Thanks,
Great
Aidan.
rebellion. I'm missing out. I'm getting major FOMO over here.
I'd like to say, come again.
I hope to come back, yes.
I think we need more of this.
Yes. Thank you and have a good day. Yeah. Great. So thank you. So I guess maybe just anyone who would like to go, I think that maybe we also say thank you to those and goodbye before we move on. And then I'll pass it back to you, Viv and Rath, to manage this.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Thanks, Joy.
Bye, Joy.
I think Ruth is also, great.
And just seeing Rowan was saying about Nancy's question as well. So I don't know whether you want to bring that in before we open it up more.
Yeah, shall I just do that? It feels like it, otherwise it's sort of
sounds
funky.
good. And
Yeah. So you asked what I meant by platforming. I can't remember what words I used now. I think I said something about framing and platforming. And what I meant by that is that there's something about, just like we have the nonviolent container, which doesn't have any necessarily. There isn't a fence there or anything, and yet it can be discerned by people who see that there's a different thing happening. I think that the same kind of principle can be applied to somebody who's going to speak passionately and possibly express rage at an institution such as the police, that if it's somehow framed and they have a microphone and that they're introduced in some way, that creates a certain kind of boundary and a certain sense of safety to anybody who's listening, because again they see, this person's been invited to speak, and that sort of makes it feel safe and sort of okay somehow. It's part of it's almost part of a ritual of how we allow people to speak, isn't it, in our society? And so I'm suggesting that, a skillful framing and platforming in that way creates a sense of safety to anybody that's listening, even if rage is expressed, and even to, you know, in this case, if the police are a witness to this and it's rage at the police, that they also will feel a sense of this is being held in a certain way, even though it's uncomfortable. I can accept it more because it's being held by the organisers in a particular way and given space that in a way that maybe isn't so threatening to them. That's what I meant. I hope that makes sense.
Nancy?
That's framing. What did you mean by platforming?
I meant giving them a stage. You know, they have the stage. They have everybody's attention, like a platform, you know, or like a podium almost. But I mean, maybe this is something that could come into the circle if people want to discuss that more. Yeah.